Hey everyone, I'm Jamie Batch, your instructor for AMP2. We are continuing on with our description or analysis, I guess, of chapter 25, which is fluid balance and acid-base balance, electrolyte balance. In the last lecture, we were just talking about the different fluid components in our body, as well as how our body maintains a basic fluid equilibrium through balancing the ICF and the ECF. Now we're going to talk more specifically about minerals and how they maintain their osmotic differences and concentration gradients. So I'm switching here so that you can see the PowerPoint and my little face in the corner at the same time. Overall, mineral balance, same idea here. It's maintained through absorption and secretion, right? We're absorbing through the small intestine and the digestive tract. We're excreting mostly at the kidneys. These are the soluble minerals that we are constantly bringing in and out, right? So you should be thinking of things like sodium, chloride, right? This is variable loss of the sweat glands, but for the most part, we're talking about the kidneys. Our body can maintain a reserve of a few minerals, but daily intake needs to basically counteract the amount that is lost every day in order to stay in balance. In other words, our stores of these minerals isn't enough to sustain us over an extended period of time. You need to have proper nutrition. Sorry, these allergies are not fun. All right, so here you just see ion absorption across the epithelium. Your skeleton can be like a sink for some of these minerals. However, if you're taking minerals away from your bones and other structures, obviously those structures are going to suffer in their own integrity for sacrificing of the ECF and ICF balance. So it's really important that your nutrition is on point for these minerals. You also excrete them through your sweat and oil secretions as well as at the kidneys. Here are specific minerals that we're talking about. These are the minerals we've been talking about since day one: sodium, calcium, potassium, magnesium, iron even, chloride, iodine, right? Bicarbonate, nitrate, phosphate, sulfate, all of these. And how are they absorbed? Do you need to know specifically how each of these absorb? No, but I think some of these you should already know already. For instance, potassium and sodium, right? You already know that these are channel mediated, the sodium gates and the calcium and the potassium gates. Calcium, you should already know, is active transport. We've talked about that several times throughout the various semesters. And that's the big one. Chloride, we mentioned a little bit when we talked about the chloride shift, right, for a bicarbonate and a chloride ion, remember, in the red blood cells. So some of these we've touched base on briefly. These are looking at what these specific minerals do in the body, which you should already know from our nutrition section. But if you don't know already, these are the kind of big key players: potassium, sodium, chloride, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. You don't need to know the RDA for them. Or how they're excreted, but primarily, obviously, all of this is leaving in the urine, as we talked about in the last chapter with the urinary system. Here's some more: iron, zinc, copper, manganese, and cobalt. Most of those are cofactors or coenzymes for metabolism. Again, don't need to know specifically the RDA, but you do need to know that these are eliminated in the urine. So you can pause the video here, go back and review this section on mineral balance. We're going to keep moving and talking specifically about one mineral in particular, and that is sodium. So sodium gains and sodium losses have to be maintained in equilibrium. That is the theme to this chapter. It's all about equilibrium. So there's regulatory mechanisms that take place to exchange the ECF volume while keeping the sodium concentrations stable. So for instance, when sodium gains exceed sodium losses, the ECF volume is going to increase. When sodium losses exceed the gains, the ECF volume is going to decrease. So in other words, water follows salt. When the sodium, and I say salt loosely, right? I'm talking about sodium specifically. When sodium levels drop, so does the ECF volume. When sodium levels rise, so does the ECF volume. This is the primary hormone that's involved the primary hormone that's involved is ADH, antidiuretic hormone, in balancing out the sodium concentration. So very small changes in the extracellular volume do not cause any very wide physiological effects in terms of sodium balance. So if you have a little bit of extra sodium, it's not going to cause that many that large of a physiological effect compared to some of these other ones. So just take a look at this homeostasis graphic here. Again, you start where it says start with homeostasis. You have a normal concentration, and then for some reason you have maybe a large consumption of salt. Maybe you just ate a bunch of very salty popcorn. That sounds really good right now. Or salty French fries, something like that, right? A pretzel with salt on it. So you have this increase in extracellular salt content. So osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are going to say, whoa, we got a lot of sodium floating around in our blood. That's going to cause ADH to be secreted. ADH is going to restrict water loss at the kidneys. ADH is also going to prompt your thirst centers. That's going to cause this recall of fluids, retaining fluid, bringing in more fluid, getting the volume up. Remember, water follows sodium, water follows salt. So if you have a lot of salt in the extracellular volume, just like after you drink or eat a lot of salt, then your extracellular volume is going to increase because water is going to be deposited there. That's going to bring your overall homeostasis and osmotic balance back to normal, decreasing the concentrations because it's increasing the amount of water there. Same thing, decrease sodium levels in the ECF, so the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are inhibited. So ADH secretion is going to decrease, which is going to allow you to pee out, so to speak, more fluid, more water, which is going to bring the overall concentration back up. Reducing water loss and extracellular volume concentrations of these ions are going to increase, and that's going to basically increase the amount of sodium in the extracellular fluid. So when there are changes in the extracellular volume, when they're extreme, I should say, there's other homeostatic mechanisms that are put into place. So if the extracellular fluid volume is increased, that's going to lead to an increase in blood volume and blood pressure. So then your body's going to respond with mechanisms in order to lower blood volume and blood pressure. How does our body do that? Well, to lower blood pressure, we have that ANP and BNP reflexes from the heart, right? ECF volume decreases. If you have a decrease in blood volume and a decrease in blood pressure, then there's mechanisms in place to restore that. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about the renin and angiotensin system, which is going to release aldosterone and ADH to allow for the retention of sodium and water at the kidneys. All right, so and that's exactly what these are looking at. So you have normal ECF volume, and then all of a sudden you have an increase an extreme, right? These are extreme changes. An extreme increase of ECF volume by gain of either fluid or sodium. That's going to cause an increase in blood volume, stretching the atria. Those ANP and BNP natriuretic peptides are going to be released by the cardiac muscle cells in the atrium. That's going to cause an increase in sodium loss, an increase in water loss, a decrease in thirst, inhibition of ADH aldosterone, as well as epinephrine and norepinephrine to be released. And that's going to overall decrease the amount of blood volume, therefore decrease blood pressure, get us back to homeostasis, right? What I like to do with these is I appreciate that the textbook creates this nice little circle for us, but I like a flowchart. I like something linear, right? So take each of these things, put them on a note card or post-it, shuffle them up and see if you can put them in order, right? Same thing with this one. Here you have a dramatic decrease in extracellular fluid volume by either fluid loss or sodium loss. Therefore, you have a drop in blood pressure, drop in blood volume. That's going to cause that renin-angiotensin system to be activated, releasing aldosterone and ADH, increasing retention of sodium, increasing retention of water, increasing our thirst, increasing water intake, overall getting our extracellular fluid volume back up to normal. So with sodium imbalances, this would be in conditions where you have a sustained sodium imbalance, and this is typically secondary to a severe fluid imbalance problem because water and sodium, I should be saying, are so linked together. So hyponatremia is where you have very low sodium concentrations in your blood or body, and hypernatremia is where you have too much. So these are potentially life-threatening conditions. Hyponatremia, this is that like water intoxication, having too much pure water brought into your body with not enough salt. This is why athletes that are sweating profusely on a hot summer day shouldn't be just drinking water. They should be drinking something that has a little bit of sodium in it or electrolytes in it, like a Gatorade, or I prefer to drink a diluted Gatorade solution. But you know, anything with some electrolytes is better than just pure water when you're sweating profusely on a really, really hot day. Hypernatremia is mostly caused by dehydration. So you can pause the video here, go back and review this section. We're going to talk briefly about potassium balance. So potassium and sodium balance are strongly linked together because of this kind of love-hate relationship these ions have with each other. Key factors in maintaining balance for potassium include how quickly that potassium is absorbed and how quickly is it removed from our urinary system. Potassium ions are opposite of sodium ions because of that sodium-potassium pump. So when we're talking about there being a very large concentration of sodium in the ECF, we're talking about there being a very large concentration of potassium in the ICF. Right? So they always move opposite of one another. And likewise, the hormones that cause an influx or a retention of sodium cause a removal of potassium. They're always opposite of one another. So let's look at some of these specific factors controlling potassium balance. What I like to do with this page is I would turn it into a graphic organizer. I like to look at things graphically and schematically. I'm a very visual person. So at the top, I would have factors controlling potassium balance. Boom, 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 right? All of these things on this page. So approximately 100 milliequivalents of potassium ions are brought in through the digestive tract. That's an increase, right? 98% of the potassium in the body is in the ICF rather than the ECF. That should be a known fact that we already know. Potassium concentration in the ECF is relatively low because the potassium and sodium is relatively high. So sodium-potassium pump. And when potassium balance exists, the rate of urinary potassium excretion matches the rate of absorption in the digestive tract. So what's going on here? It moves from our blood into the extracellular fluid into the cells, right? That's what these arrows are showing. If we start all the way on the left, that is meant to represent our digestive system being absorbed from our digestive system into the ECF, and then in exchange for sodium, it's going into the cell. So the concentration in the cell is very, very high. Then if we have too much in the blood, it's going to be excreted at the kidneys. So kidneys are the main factor in regulating our potassium balance in the ECF. The dietary intake of potassium is relatively constant, and so potassium loss is controlled by aldosterone. Remember good old aldosterone that controls sodium concentrations? Well, remember I said sodium and potassium are strongly linked. So it's working in the opposite. Aldosterone retains sodium, but it removes potassium. So aldosterone is going to stimulate sodium reabsorption in the kidneys, but it's going to also promote potassium excretion in the urine. So very low pH in the ECF can cause hydrogen ions to actually be substituted for potassium ions. So potassium and hydrogen ions are also linked together, and we're going to look more closely at this as we move on in this chapter. So here you see what I'm talking about. This presence of aldosterone is going to put those little aquaporins in there, exchanging not just water, but also sodium and potassium. Potassium always moves opposite of sodium because of those nice little pumps that are always put in place. You have hypokalemia, being where you have very low plasma levels of potassium. This could be caused by diuretics or having excessive aldosterone secretion. So if you have too much aldosterone, meaning you're retaining lots and lots of sodium, you're getting rid of lots and lots of potassium. You would have very weak muscles, maybe even paralysis in this case. It can be very lethal because it affects your heart. And when we need potassium for those concentration gradients with the hyperpolarization and repolarization with action potentials, and that's super crucial to our cardiocytes. Treatment would be obviously just increasing dietary intake of potassium. Hyperkalemia is when your potassium levels are elevated. This could be caused by chronically low pH, having a very acidic condition in your body, in other words, or kidney failure, which could be indicative because of that low blood pH, as well as drugs that are promoting diuresis by blocking sodium potassium pumps and allowing for the hyperexcretion of water. In other words, a buildup of potassium. So symptoms could be heart arrhythmias or muscular spasms for hyperkalemia. You don't want to mess around with potassium, people. Potassium can be deadly, right? If it's out of balance. Any of these can be, really, but potassium, because it has this strong link to how our heart is hyperpolarizing, it's really important to make sure we have potassium in balance. Leafy greens, guys, potassium in those leafy greens and bananas. Treatment of hyperkalemia includes diluting our extracellular fluid with a low potassium solution, or stimulating potassium loss in the urine with the use of diuretics, maybe even adjusting the pH of the extracellular fluid volume, restricting dietary potassium intake, and dialysis if renal failure is indicated. So this is looking at factors that promote hypo as well as hyperkalemia. Things like diuretics or endocrine disorders can promote hypokalemia. Hyperkalemia can be caused by our pH being off, as well as kidney failure and drugs. So you can pause the video here. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to stop the video here because the next section kind of switches gears for us. So we talked about sodium and potassium, two super important ions already. And in the next section, we're going to get more into acid-base balance. All right, I'll see you in a bit.